The motion is, this house believes that feminists should regret the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. So now the debaters will be moving into their breakout rooms and they'll be prepping for 30 minutes. During that time, Nadia and I will speak to you briefly about what this motion is about.
Okay, great. Cool. All right, let's start with the motion primer. So what we'll be doing is just taking you guys through a bit of context with regards to the themes and the current real life situations behind this motion. So hopefully you have a better understanding later. So to start things off really simply, let's talk about feminism because that's what this motion's about. So next slide. So you may have heard like the standard dictionary of definition of feminism, the one that says it's the social, political, economic equality of the sexes. But I think that if there's one concept behind feminism that we all should be familiar with is this whole idea of choice. The idea of choice is really important. All right, so I think a really good way of looking at the feminist movement is through the first 3 waves. And this is just to give you a brief history, but also helps us understand the different ideologies within the feminist movement. So the first wave, which happened around the 1990s, early 1900s, focused on the legal recognition of women as fellow human beings. So this meant that women were able to own property and were given the right to vote. Then fast forward a few decades, we had the second wave of feminism, which strove to recognize women outside the traditional family structure. This meant that women were able to work, get educated, get equal pay, and also get abortions. The third wave of feminism becomes a little bit more complicated because while the second wave was trying to get women outside the house, the third wave tried to recognize the idea of nuances in the whole concept of women's choice. That meant that third wave feminists were supportive of women who wanted to reclaim female sexuality. So do simple things like wear makeup, wear high heels if they wanted to, even though that's traditionally feminine, as well as do things like become a stay-at-home mother. So why exactly do we have debates on feminism? The reason why I talked about the waves earlier is because there are often tensions between these different waves. So for example, the third wave of feminism would tell you that motherhood is empowering if women choose to do so. But the second wave of feminists would tell you that it may be counterproductive to getting women in the workforce. And these sort of tensions within feminism are popular not only in the world of debating, but also in the world of pulp culture and the world in general. And in general, because feminism tries to encapsulate the ideas of literally half the population, it's hard to get feminists as a whole to agree on one approach, which is why we have debates regarding feminism. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, let's talk a little bit about the current challenges surrounding motherhood, because that would sort of give us an idea of the status quo that the motion is trying to fix. Next slide. So I took this infographic from AWARE, the Association of Women's Action and Research. They had an Instagram account, and this graphic was really cool. So basically what it tells us is that caregiving and motherhood in general takes up a lot of time. So mothers often, women in general who choose to be mothers or caregivers don't get to participate in the labor force and don't get to work. So you can see from those statistics that the discrepancy is really quite jarring. Next slide. All right, okay, so let's talk about the current challenges surrounding motherhood. So in the workplace, women who choose to be mothers often have to take time off from maternity leave. And even if they're able to go back in the future, this often sets back their career by a few years. If women don't choose to be mothers, there's also this idea of employers' expectation when they're hiring women around like 20 or 30 years old. They expect women to have children a few years down the line, even if they aren't currently mothers, and may automatically disadvantage them in the hiring process because the idea of a woman having to take maternity leave would hinder their ability to do good work in like a couple of years. There's also the idea of the problem of not having enough flexible working arrangements to enable women to juggle both motherhood and career. And at home, there are also a lot of challenges that mothers face, right? Because it's often not an expectation on fathers to pull their weight in the whole caregiving process. So very often the bulk of the work falls on the mother. Child caring is also a huge responsibility that takes a mental and physical toll. There's the idea of postnatal or postpartum depression, which basically means that after a mother gives birth, like she has like really, really bad, like mental health issues. They're often not they're not compensated for childcare and work. So even though motherhood is a huge responsibility, there's no way they get paid for it, unlike a regular job. And this whole idea of mom shaming, I think it's more popular in like Western culture, or maybe just it's called out more. So this whole idea of like when mothers bring their kids around, mothers of other kids would pick on their methods of parenting, like, oh, why do you not spend enough time with your kid? Or why do you feed your kid certain items? Because when it comes to motherhood or parenting in general, there's just no one way to do it. So very often mothers are subject to critique by other mothers for their own choices. And there's lastly, there's that idea of childcare services. So if moms want to juggle both work and parenting, very often what they do is put their kid in a childcare center and then pick their kid up after work. But the problem is these services are often really expensive. And even if they're able to get these services, they often only accommodate for like 9 to 5 jobs. So these services will only run after school to about like 5 p.m., 6 p.m. Whereas if you're a mother who wants to work like say an evening shift or work really odd hours, they're often not childcare services that are accessible for you. It's also important to take a look at the relevant government policies. So abortion laws are actually a big one, in my opinion. If we view motherhood as an empowering experience, for example, this could be a narrative that can be capitalized on by, say, the pro-life movement, which tells mothers that, oh, why get an abortion when you have such a gift of such a fulfilling experience that you could potentially have later on down the line. Egg freezing is another government policy that I think is worthy of talking about. It's worthy to note that it's not actually allowed in Singapore unless it's a medical emergency. So the narrative that motherhood is empowering could affect it either way. It could actually push for egg freezing to be allowed so that women at later ages could still have kids because it's such a fulfilling experience. So just notice that like challenges in the workplace, public policy at home, all affect how women are able to plan how motherhood affects their lives. All right, next slide. All right, let's talk about the narrative that motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling in particular. So notice that, just to clarify, the wording of the motion that it's intrinsically fulfilling means that this narrative is applicable to all cases, regardless of other factors. So you could take a look at it from 2 perspectives. So the first perspective is that even if a mother, a woman is plagued with all the problems that I talked about earlier, that motherhood is going to be really, really bad, the workplace is never going to be accommodating to her, the dad is not going to be in the picture, women will still choose to be mothers because of this intrinsically fulfilling narrative. Another way to take a look at it is, even if as a society we try to fix all these problems, like we get good maternity leave, we get good work-life balance for women, this narrative could potentially act as the final push or the final shackle, however you want to take a look at it, that leads women to choosing motherhood. So I didn't put it on the slide, but there was actually a study done that interviewed women who graduated from the same university. So it was a private university in the States. So they were sort of disproportionately advantaged in the whole idea of like starting at a very good place in terms of their career. And what these women said was that, well, when it came to maternity leave or like flexible working accommodations, their employers were actually quite accommodating. But a lot of them still chose to leave their careers behind and become full-time mothers because of essentially this narrative, the idea that they felt so guilty that they were missing out by not being there full-time for their kids. So that's something to think about. Next slide. So before we get into how the debate should look like, I think it's important to characterize what these narratives look like and who enforces these narratives. So I'm not sure if like the images on the right-hand side are being blocked out by our faces, but it doesn't matter. So basically, the narratives can go either way. There's some really, really positive examples of these narratives, like the popular view that the interaction between mothers and their children are full of love, viewing mothers as heroes, viewing motherhood as a challenging yet rewarding task. So these are narratives that empower mothers, but there are also narratives that are negative, narratives that shame women who choose not to be mothers because they lack the love and compassion that it takes to be a mother, or telling women that they're missing out if they don't experience motherhood instead of letting them choose for themselves. So this narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience kind of proliferates in very different ways. And depending on whether you're proposition or opposition, you can sort of capitalize on these different characterizations to boost your case. Next slide. All right, so now that we've established what these narratives are, I think it's also important to take a look at who enforces these narratives. So it could be really innocent, like mothers actively sharing on, for example, social media of how fulfilled motherhood has made them, or telling their friends this through friendly conversations. But it could also be quite toxic. For example, your mom expecting you as like her daughter to have a kid, or telling her that, you know, your biological clock is ticking, so you have to have a kid ASAP if you want to get this fulfilling experience. You could have a spouse who decides that the reason he doesn't want to take care of your kid along with you is because of this narrative. Oh, because being a mother is supposed to be a fulfilling experience for you, I should not take that away from you, and therefore I'm not going to help. So that's a kind of a toxic way to enforce this narrative. In the workplace and in public policy, it's an expectation that a female employee around the childbearing age will have kids. So this expectation can be brought up during interviews or during casual chats, like, oh, by the way, when are you going to have a kid? And if the female employee, for example, says, oh, I don't plan to have a kid, it's very easy for people in the workplace and colleagues in general to say, well, are you sure you want to miss out on this experience? And another thing is the idea of how employers, as a result of these narratives, view when their employees choose to be a mother, they view that as a self-serving act, or as an act that's going to bring them gratitude. And therefore, they think that, oh, because you're going off and doing something that you love, why should I bother giving you good maternity leave advantages, or giving you the ability to keep your job because you're going off to do something fulfilling anyway. So these are different ways that different actors can enforce the narrative. Next slide. All right, and let's talk about alternative forces that can persuade women to have kids. And I think that this is important because these forces exist on both sides. So opposition can't just argue that, oh, without this narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, no woman is going to choose to have a mother, choose to be a mother, or choose to have kids. So there are alternative forces, right? So for example, social forces that, especially in an Asian context, we want to carry on the family name. And because of biology, women are the only ones who can do so. Or you could be married to a husband who believes that one of his life goals is to have a kid. And therefore, by being his wife, you kind of have to do that for him. It could be economic forces. So for example, in less developed areas, the idea that families need kids in order to develop their family business or tend to family farms. It could be government policies that tie welfare packages or subsidies to getting married. So for example, getting like a subsidized HDB in Singapore, I think only married couples would be eligible for that, if I'm not wrong. And with marriage often comes the pressure to like have kids in the future. I think women earning low incomes and unfulfilling work is also a big thing, as I'll explain later. All right, so the reason why I wanted to talk about these alternative forces is that they can be capitalized on by both sides. So for example, on proposition, you may argue that these forces are made stronger by the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. So for example, you're more likely to walk away from your job if you're currently earning a low income and unfulfilling work, and you think your work prospect is just really, really crappy. And therefore, if you have this idea that, oh, motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, then you're more likely to leave an unfulfilling job for a fulfilling experience in the future. Whereas if your job was like already really great to begin with, that narrative wouldn't be as strong a persuading force, if that makes sense. Proposition can also say that this narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience is uniquely suffocating. So it's very easy for feminist groups to sort of advocate against these other social forces. So they could say, oh, the idea that you have to carry on your family name and that people and your husband should persuade you of what to do or what not to do is so archaic. It's very easy to argue against that. But when it comes to arguing against something like motherhood brings you happiness, it's very hard to say that, oh, that's a very non-feminist thing to say because it discredits the happiness of many women. So that could be an argument. On opposition, I think the way these forces can work is to diminish proposition's impact, right? That, oh, women will still choose to be moms. They will still have to be coerced to be moms under status quo, even if we don't have this narrative. So therefore, at least this narrative is still there to be a source of comfort that women can still choose to be mothers out of their own happiness. Biological forces was actually just a really interesting thing to point out. Probably not going to come out in the debate, to be honest, but the idea that certain hormones are expressed when you're breastfeeding or when you when you hold your baby for the first time, this is sort of signs that can contribute to the narrative that motherhood is fulfilling because you feel so good when you're holding your baby or when you're breastfeeding your baby. But something that's really important to note is that not all women feel the same way. So for example, the idea that women forget the pain of childbirth or disassociate from the discomfort, that's actually pseudoscience and it's not really very well studied, but that's something that a lot of women anecdotally would say. So when women suffer from postpartum depression or don't experience the sort of hormonal changes that make them feel really, really happy, they may feel really, really guilty that they don't experience how fulfilling motherhood is supposed to be, even though the science supposedly tells them that they should. So that's something to think about when it comes to the impact of these narratives. All right, I think I've talked enough. I think Kevin will walk you through the debate proper now.
All right. Hello. So this is just some thoughts that we had about the motion when we were setting the motion. We thought it would be quite educational to share with you guys how we approach motions and preparing for them. So whenever I personally receive a motion, the first thing I always do is ask myself, what is this debate about? And sometimes you're completely clueless when you receive a motion. I think that there are hints that you can find within the wording of the motion that can tell you what this debate is about. So for me, the two words that I took from the motion were regrets and feminists. So I think what the takeaway is from the word regrets is that it tells you that this is a retrospective motion. So I think there was a workshop done previously that explains the different kinds of motions. So policy motions are debated very differently from a motion that's a regrets motion. Because in a policy motion, you need to outline the policy. You need to explain why the policy is effective. Regrets motions is kind of debated like you are evaluating something that has already been done. So retrospective meaning in the past. So in the same way that you consider to yourself how do you regret something you did in the past, it's the same way you approach a regrets motion, at least in my opinion. So you need to consider the things that already happened or have some form of framework to weigh whether this is beneficial or not, and then you come to the conclusion about whether this is something worth regretting or not. The thing about regrets motion is that you do need a counterfactual if you regret something. So if you do regret it, then what would you want to happen instead? And this is where I think you need to use your imagination. So you need to imagine a world where this narrative did not exist. And what do you think this world would look like? So I think Nadia gave you a lot of very good examples of alternative narratives in her previous slides. So these are ideas that you can have, right? So it's not just about regretting one thing and then saying you don't like that thing. It's also about talking about the world that you would prefer. And if you notice, that makes the debate a lot more comparative because you're directly comparing two worlds. It makes it very easy for the judge to go, which world would I prefer to live in? Again, I think it just helps with making the debate a lot cleaner. Like a lot of feedback that judges give about regrets motion is it's very messy. You know, I don't know how to weigh the different things that are being said. If you have a very clear comparison between the two different worlds, then I think it makes it a lot easier. But you can't just assert that the world will be this way. You also have to give reasons as to why the world will evolve in this way if you regret this narrative. So I think that's the first key word, the first key takeaway from the motion. The second is quite obviously the word feminist. So this motion is not just generically, let's discuss about social narratives. They're asking for the attitude a specific actor should hold, right? So you need to outline the interests of this actor. You need to paint and illustrate to us what this feminist movement looks like. So we are able to put ourselves in the mind of the feminist movement and determine whether the feminist movement should or should not regret something. And I think that adds a lot more character to the debate. It grounds the debate a lot more when you know what the actor that is being discussed in this debate as well. So with these two pieces of information, and clearly you can draw a lot more information from the other words as well, I think you begin to see the contours of this debate. And that helps you create a filter of relevancy. So a lot of problems I've seen personally and also when I've been judging debates, is that some arguments become irrelevant. They're not linked very well to the motion. And I think sometimes when you start prepping, you get lost in your own argumentation. You have so many brilliant ideas that you want to throw out, and then you forget that you need to answer a question, which is the motion. I think by having a filter of relevancy, right, that this debate is about retrospection and this debate is about the feminist movement, it helps you not lose sight of the debate. And I think that's particularly important towards the end of the debate in showing the judge that you have answered the question, right, that you have given sufficient reason why this should be regretted or not. So I hope that you guys will be able to apply this to your own prep to make sure that all the things you say are relevant. If you're wondering what is considered relevant, the words in the debate outline the parameters for what should be discussed. Okay, so let's go to burdens. So I think you guys should already be familiar with what burdens are. Burdens are things that you need to prove in a debate. The total sum of your words should prove something at the end of your speech. You should be trying to prove a point. So these are just two burdens that I've personally chosen the debate should be about. These are not like the answer key to this motion. I think the debaters later might choose different motions. There are a whole variety of motions that you can choose, but these, for the purpose of demonstration, these are the two burdens I've chosen. So I want to clarify that first. Different debaters choose different burdens. There's no like always correct answer or always wrong answer. It's just how you debate it. So on proposition, I've chosen that this narrative restricts the choice of women. I think Nadia touched about this briefly as well. How that if you think it's an intrinsically fulfilling experience, you're likely to want to do it more than your job, which is probably not very fulfilling. And on opposition, I chose the burden that your arguments should prove that the narrative comfort women who do choose to be mothers. Because on both sides of the house, there will obviously still be mothers, or else the birth rate will decline very sharply. So these are just the two burdens that I've chosen. I think given what Nadia said previously, you can kind of have some analysis to see why proposition would choose this burden and why opposition should choose this burden. I think just a quick crash course on how I personally choose burdens is that burdens should be realistic. Right? So you don't want to take a burden that is impossible to discharge. Like I wouldn't want to say that choose a big and impossible burden like this narrative would cause millions and millions of deaths. Because, you know, even if I prove it, I win the debate. But it's also big and impossible to prove. But you also don't want to choose very small, insignificant burdens that don't win you the debate even if you prove it. So I think that's the kind of discussion that you want to have in prep. Is this burden realistic? Can we as a team reasonably prove this point that we're trying to make? And, you know, even if we do prove it, does this build towards a win? So I think that's the kind of strategy you need to have in your mind when you're choosing burdens. So I think burdens achieve two things. One is that you have very clear win conditions. You are very focused on how you want to win this debate. But the second thing is also prevents you from running arguments that are irrelevant because you're always reminded this argument needs to prove this thing that my previous speaker said. So it helps with the team stance thing. It helps with consistency across the bench when you guys are all defending the same points. And later on, I'll show you also, by having clear burdens, it actually makes clashes very easy. So it makes the job of your third speaker, your third proposition or your third opposition, incredibly easy when you have very clear burdens that are proven well. So before I talk about the clashes in the debate and the arguments that you guys can run, I want to note that both of these burdens I've chosen are actually clashing with one another already. And I think you can observe that in the wording. So proposition says this restricts the choice of women, and then opposition claims that women do choose to be mothers still. So if you realize only one of these things can be true, is it the case that proposition is correct and that women's choices are being restricted, or is it the case that opposition is correct and that women are liberated sufficiently that they're able to choose the path of being a mother? And in that sentence alone, I hope you can see that that's what the clash is going to become about. Are women free to choose? So this is just where there's no slides and I'll just be talking, so I hope that you guys don't get lost. When proposition wants to talk about choice being restricted, they have to paint a picture of what society looks like. They have to give us contextual information. So there are a lot of other things you can point towards in society that proves that women's choices are being severely restricted. Things like there being a lot of men in parliament and in policy making, things like many family structures being patriarchal in nature and daughters need to default to the opinions of their fathers. All of this would show that there is a limited capacity for women to make choices. Conversely, opposition can also pick and choose examples to paint to us a context that women are liberated sufficiently. Things about many new laws being passed that helps women get maternity leave. Things like abortion laws being passed in previously conservative states. These are all ideas that opposition can forward that show that, in fact, women are able to exercise more choice now than they were before. Again, this is what we call in the debate a deadlock, because it cannot simultaneously be true as proposition claims that women's choices are severely restricted, but also the case that opposition claims that women's choices are liberated to a sufficient extent. So this is where I think you need to take the middle ground, because if you only want to debate in your context and they only want to debate in their context, then there's no clash. You guys are only running arguments within the confines of what is a convenient society for you. So I think these are just a couple of ideas you can have as to what you can run to break the kind of deadlocks that would happen. So on opposition, in response, can talk about how choice is unimportant if proposition can't talk about removing patriarchal limitations. So I think let's go back a bit to look at the burdens so you guys can remember, is that the narrative restricts the choices of women. If opposition can shift the angle of the debate, that complete liberation of women in the short term might not be possible given how deeply entrenched patriarchal is, opposition can move the needle to say, we are at a point right now where women can reasonably assess that they should be mothers. So I hope that you see there's a bit of angle shift happening here, that opposition is challenging the claim from prop that the angle of the feminist movement should be to completely liberate women and to get maximize choice. And I think that there are many ways you can go about doing this. The first is to say that it's unrealistic, right? It's unrealistic for proposition to claim that they want the complete liberation of women or the complete liberation of choice. But the second thing you can also claim is to prove that the angle is something that is not possible for all groups of people, not just females. Like the fact that society coerces people a lot in general, the fact that a lot of our decisions now are shaped by our family members or by society or by social norms would suggest that the ability for us to make maximized and free choice is something severely limited, and maybe proposition shouldn't gun for that. All of these arguments push the opposition claim to a point where it's easier for you to prove that this amount of choice that women have right now is the optimal choice. That means that they're freely able to choose that they want to be mothers. And therefore, the women that do choose to be mothers, that do not get this narrative, are hurt. So I hope that that's not too convoluted. But by shifting the angle, it allows them for the burden to be fulfilled, that women can choose to be mothers, and that these women are presumably important people in the debate that we should care about. I think the second thing, I think the prep's almost over, so I'll just briefly talk about this, is that the debate can also be expanded to talk about other people as well. How do other people respond to these narratives? So social narratives don't just exist in the minds of women. There also are things that your employers, your fathers, your brothers, or your friends and your classmates can co-opt. I think there's a reasonable there are reasonable parts of this debate where you can discuss how other people react to these narratives. So how does your father think? What does your father think when he's taught from young that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience? And how does this change the way he perceives his daughter? I think there's a lot of intricate illustrations that needs to be done here. Instead of just saying theoretical things, it's important for us to delve into the mind of people and see how do social creatures react to social narratives. Yeah. So I hope that's been clear. I hope you have a better idea of what these debates look like, how to approach prep. And hopefully the debaters later will say some of the things that we've said, because we actually don't know what they're going to be saying later. So I think prep time is over. I'll be now passing the time to our very helpful chairperson, Tai Ching, to conduct the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin and Nadia, for an insightful analysis of the motion for today's exhibition debate. Kevin and Nadia are part of the adjudication core of the Debate Association Debating Championships, so you can be assured that all the motions for DADC's 2020 are as exciting and interesting as this one. Without further ado, may I invite the debaters back from their preparation rooms and begin the exhibition debate. My name is Tai Ching, and I will be your chairman and timekeeper for this debate. For the purposes of this debate, each speaker will have 6 minutes to make their speeches, and after all 6 substantive speeches have been made, each team will have the opportunity to make a 3-minute reply speech. This can be made by either the first or second speaker on the team. No points of information are allowed during reply speeches. The opposition will make their reply speech first. It now gives me great pleasure to announce the debaters participating in the Debate Association exhibition debate. Introducing the proposition. The first proposition speaker for this debate is Viha. Viha is a shining star in the Singaporean circuit. From becoming Interpoly champion in her high school days, to becoming UADC champion and a 2 times ABP finalist in university, Viha is a true inspiration to aspiring debaters. She has also served as DCA of major international tournaments like ABP and Australs. The second proposition speaker for this debate is Farhan. As described by friend Kevin Tay, the only thing bigger than Farhan's heart is his brain. Farhan has been a long-standing member of the Singapore debating community and has always been generous in giving advice and feedback to newer debaters. And what better person than the ABP finalist, Penang Debate Championship finalist, SIMDO champion, and WRNUS 2019 champion to be a figure of guidance for our circuit. Farhan is also a co-adjudicator of DADC's 2020. And the third proposition speaker is Adil. Adil Hakim is a president's scholar. But that's really not the point. His success extends beyond just academics, and he is an excellent debater, winning the United Asians Debating Championships and then serving as an EdgeCore member. He has also won the World Schools Debating Championship and was the grand finalist of the Asian British Parliamentary Debating Championship, a debating legend that has gone through dark times and, having been beaten down by others, has risen up and dominated the JC and university circuit. The reply will be delivered by Viha. Introducing the opposition. The first opposition speaker is Huiyi. Huiyi has made an indelible mark on the Singapore debate scene. She might be known as the person who managed to represent 3 different Singapore unis at major international tournaments. But she's a lot more than just that. From being a UADC champion and Australs quarterfinalist, to being an excellent coach to both Singapore Polytechnic and Paya Lebar Methodist Girls' School, to edge-coring multiple tournaments, Huiyi has done it all in debating and has done it all incredibly well. The second opposition speaker is Subra. Subra is the ultimate role model for what perseverance and hard work can achieve. Having to hold an entire university debate club together almost single-handedly for 3 years didn't stop him from coming out of the other side with incredible achievements like ABP finalist, Australs quarterfinalist, and Cambridge 4th quarterfinalist. He has also gone on to EdgeCore at numerous tournaments and coach debating at a few different schools. And the third opposition speaker is Joel. Not to be outdone by the impressive careers of the previous speakers, Joel is also an equally impressive and seasoned debater. He has won the UT Mara Debating Open and more recently has won the Cicero World Tour, finishing as the overall best speaker. As a judge, he has broken at the United Asians Debating Championships 2018, served as the Deputy Chief at NTU Pro-Ams 2019, and even was an independent adjudicator at the World's University Debating Championships. The reply will be delivered by Huiyi. The motion for today's debate is, this House believes that feminists should regret the narrative that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. Without further ado, I call the House to order and invite the first speaker for the proposition to open the debate.
Can everyone hear me? Is this okay? Historically, women all across the world are consigned and shackled to the notion that motherhood is their end goal in life. Their value is determined by whether or not they manage to get married, settle down, and have multiple children. The truth of the matter is this narrative was constructed by the patriarchy, and on side proposition, we will stand for it no longer. 2 bits of characterization before my substantive. First, on how the narrative came about, and secondly, what the alternative is that we think feminists should defend. So first, how did this narrative come about at all? We think this narrative was constructed by the patriarchy, that cultural norms dictated that they should be homemakers and only handle the family and should not look to being paid for any of that because, hey, it is intrinsically fulfilling already. But 2, it is reinforced by every single part of society. Unfair workplace conditions like chances of landing promotions and jobs are dependent on that. Movies and cinemas do it also. Our own family, through generations upon generations of this, continue to perpetuate this for us. But 3, this homogenizes all women to feeling the exact same way about it because it is easier to control women when you say, look, all other women also feel intrinsically fulfilled by this. Therefore, it must be biologically natural to you and you should feel it feel it too. We think that that narrative is toxic and manipulative. What is the alternative that we think feminists should defend instead? One, we think that motherhood could possibly be a good experience given that experiences are subjectively interpreted. The fundamental problem we have is that the term intrinsically fulfilling experience blindsides women to the cost associated with motherhood. What would the world have looked like if feminists have a choice? We would defend a counter-narrative that empowers and encourages women to prioritize themselves first. What this looks like is a woman should be able to decide what is best for herself rather than deferring the autonomy to make such choices to someone else or to an assumption that one particular type of end goal is intrinsically more fulfilling than any other type of experience. In case division, we're going to do two things in this speech. One, in my first speech, I'm going to talk about why this is objectively bad for individual women. There are about 2 to 3 different layers here. Farhan in second will then talk about why this hurts the feminist movement as a collective, and therefore why the feminist movement should push forward in regretting and rejecting this narrative in and of itself. So let's start with that first substantive. Why is it objectively bad for individual women to have this narrative out in society that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience? The first thing we want to talk about is the fact that this is an uninformed decision that women get into. No woman ever really knows what motherhood truly feels like until it has already happened to them. There is no way of that, even no matter how much research you do, no matter how much academic theory, understanding of the process you learn from your friends around you or your own mother, you don't truly understand the pains, the toils, and the trauma that comes from the concept of motherhood in and of itself. This means that the only thing that can persuade you into choosing motherhood is one that is built purely academically and you're making the decision uninformed. The problem with this is that once you step into motherhood, there is no reversal. There is no going back because you are stuck in that process for at least the next 18 years and you have to suffer through the traumas of that position even though you know you are not meant to be in that position and you're stuck there wholly. We think that the narrative that feeling fulfilled is important is something that people naturally by human instinct crave. You crave feeling fulfilled, you crave wanting you crave wanting to be have that feeling of being fulfilled, and therefore it's a narrative that's attractive and therefore is often manipulative. After you get pregnant, there is no way to identify what this issue is and how to rectify it from there. Joel.
Yeah, so are you also implying that you would be happy to alienate women that have made the choice, and are you willing to also claim that those choices are just invalid?
That is completely mishearing everything we talked about earlier about what we are defending on our side. We told you very clearly that what we defend is that motherhood could be a good experience, but that you need to define that for yourself and that it is not intrinsically fulfilling for all women generally, and that you need to decide whether it was a fulfilling experience for yourself. So if you have chosen motherhood now, it is absolutely important that you decide whether it is fulfilling for yourself as opposed to a general narrative that says it should be biologically, intrinsically fulfilling for all women. The second thing that we need to talk about, because let's be real, as we just talked about, this decision is often uninformed when you step into it, and that is in and of itself a problem. But secondly, we think that it also hurts all women regardless of whether they chose motherhood or not, because intrinsically fulfilling automatically is a power asymmetry of labor. Mothers are expected to like doing the handling of all of the things in the house that have to do with raising this child, and there's an immense expectation on them that they cannot opt out of. We think that there are 3 different results that come from this. The first is that women take the majority of the burden on in the house with no reprieve and are seen as just their obligation to do so. This means that this narrative affects even women who are not even mothers yet, because women are now told just because they are wives, just because they are daughters, that hey, motherhood and the home and the homemaking is your ultimate happiness, is your place where you will feel the most fulfilling. So the problem with the narrative isn't so much what the women themselves feel, but as is what the rest of society does with this narrative to women, because this narrative exists generally. We think that all women, even those who are not mothers, are affected by this. But secondly, we think that you get the breakdown of family units because women who are not meant for motherhood end up in a spiral of depression and anxiety, but everyone in the family just does not understand why motherhood is supposed to be intrinsic, or does not understand why, since motherhood is supposed to be intrinsic for them. Women don't get the mental health help they need, but instead get vitriol and insults from family members who claim they are not doing enough as mothers. But thirdly, women are then told that this is the end game for them anyway, which is why daughters don't get sent to school or get educated. It's why women get pushed to marriage at an early age. And it's why women don't get job priorities unless it is nurse, childcare, or babysitter. And there is no way out because there's a positive spin in society that legitimizes all of these actions upon women. We think that this is highly problematic, it's toxic, and it's manipulative of women. And it stems absolutely from saying that this is intrinsically and biologically fulfilling purely because women are who they are. We propose.
I thank speaker for her speech. I now call upon the first opposition speaker to deliver their speech.
Okay, can you guys hear me? On opposition, we believe that the language of celebrating mothers is built on the vocabulary of external respect and support towards people who take on that journey of motherhood. And we think that in downplaying and diminishing its present social cultural significance, feminism would end up on proposition's side, making motherhood all the more difficult for the many women who at some point in their life will choose to become mothers. Before I go into my case proper, a few rebuttals for the House. Firstly, on its contention that motherhood is a coerced choice, we don't think that is true. We think that things like christening parties, women who seek treatment of fertility issues, show how many women do aspire and want their motherhood be part of their entire lives. But however, right, for those who are pressured, we think at the very least we allow them a way to negotiate the kind of pressures in their life and a choice to become a mother that this social pressure has led them to at the very least, by saying this is something that you can look forward to and enjoy. But more importantly, what is the counterfactual on proposition? Basically, proposition is going to tell mothers that, oh, it is not intrinsically fulfilling to be doing what you are doing. Feminism will be telling mothers on their side, I guess you like this 18-year commitment, though many other women don't. Implication is therefore anyone who has anything good to say about being a mother and who dares to articulate it will be seen as somebody who deserves all the trials and tribulations of motherhood without getting any external support to make that journey, to make that walk any easier. Second rebuttal, Viha tells us that it's an ill-informed choice to become a mother, but we don't really buy that logic. Why is that the case? Her reason why it is ill-informed is because motherhood is a long-term 18-year choice that you haven't experienced yet. But that is a reason for saying that any long-term is therefore one you're ill-informed about, be it say a 20-year house mortgage, be it say migrating to a different country. So we don't think that is fair. And more importantly, it is easy to become informed about motherhood before you choose to become pregnant. For instance, you could research, you could find support circles, and that is far more possible on our side if people already think that motherhood is a lovely concept and therefore form things like motherhood support groups to celebrate each other's motherhood and how to cope with it. Next rebuttal, on this idea that we create expectation to do more towards all women. We think there's a conflation of all child-raising duties with the larger spectrum of household labor, emotional labor, or domestic labor that women often get forced to do. And I think, as I'll show you later, we are the ones that create, no thank you, more support towards women and therefore allow them to cope with this kind of burdens that come with motherhood better. But the last thing, on how we therefore make things very difficult for people who choose not to have children in their lives. We think that it is unfair for you, however, to propose that people who choose to stay childless tear women who choose to be mothers down by saying their experience does not have any inherent value, and we want to see why basically that is something you think is worthwhile demoralizing and hurting all mothers for. But then on to my case proper. I'm going to prove to you two things. Firstly, why this narrative is correct and motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling. Secondly, why we think feminists should celebrate it. So firstly, on why there is intrinsic fulfillment. Before I go on, I will take a POI.
Why would anyone attempt to give support to a person who is doing something that they should be intrinsically fulfilled by anyway?
Right, so that actually is covered in my substantive right now. I'm going to give you a few reasons why motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling, but I'm going to show you that the reasons for this fulfillment is often tied to the need for a world that outlives mothers. And to make this work, do understand that it's a logical premise. Just because something is intrinsically fulfilling doesn't mean that it's something which cannot be corrupted. The fulfilling value of motherhood can still be corrupted should external forces not understand and not support mothers. It's the same way how we can easily argue that childhood is something that's intrinsically valuable but can be corrupted by abusive influences or traumatic life experiences. Romantic love can be intrinsically valuable but can also be corrupted by people who don't respect who you give your heart to, for instance. So then, why is motherhood intrinsically fulfilling? So the first two reasons I want to bring out is simply that, the first reason I want on the breakout is simply that there is a physical connection that creates a transcendental emotional bond. Often this stems from the miracle of the female body and its ability to not only birth the child, but also sustain the child in the first years of the how is this therefore tied to the need for external support for mothers? Because as long as we recognize that it's a physical miracle for a mother to be able to birth and raise a child, then we also recognize the need for things like medical access, for financial support, for care for that mother physically, so that mother can go about creating this intrinsically fulfilling physical miracle to start with. Second reason, often motherhood is undertaken in a spirit of sacrifice, and often sacrifice is a fulfilling process. Why? Because one of the most important sources of life purpose is in giving of oneself, is in being more than yourself and your own desires in life itself. And that's why we celebrate vocations like teaching, like firefighting, like medicine, are things that people actually choose to get into. And how does the external world make this intrinsic value stand out? Through things like support and respect for mothers and what they are doing. Lastly, let's talk a bit about the last reason why it's fulfilling. Basically, often because mothers have choice. They could have chosen to give up or to not undertake pregnancy to start with. And therefore, for that choice to actually have its true intrinsically fulfilling value, conversations about how this could create or just letting mothers feel hurt. On then to my next substantive. Why should we therefore celebrate it? We recognize that feminists cannot deny how cis women will always be the ones that are the biological carriers of children, right? And they can decide whether they want to frame it as something empowering or something limiting. When they frame it as something empowering and fulfilling, we think therefore that creates more support in the larger society, where people no longer see maternity as a burden, but a woman doing what she might consider the great work or one of the great works of her life. Also, because motherhood is seen as a beautiful and enjoyable process, therefore, people try and give mothers time to enjoy motherhood instead of being seen as this harried woman who must do all the work. We also think that often there are women that cannot afford to have it all. For instance, who are not able to provide for their child, to go to work and also look after their children. But when they give up other conventional markers of success like their career, at the very least, you create understanding because they are also doing something that's fulfilling. We therefore think we make life so much better for mothers. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for her speech. I now call upon the second proposition speaker to deliver their speech.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, can. Oops. Motherhood might truly be a miracle for some, as Huiyi rightfully points out, but it is a nightmare for many. The first part of Huiyi's speech is just unimportant given the context of this debate, because we never once disputed, coming up from Viha's speech, that motherhood as an experience could be fulfilling for some individuals, given that experiences are subjectively interpreted and evaluated by each and every individual. I think the term that Huiyi casually ignores is the term intrinsic, which means that based on what Viha have told you, that a lot of the experiences that women have, that they are made to feel that motherhood is the be-all and end-all outcome for them, and that the experiences that they are able to extrapolate from motherhood is something that's so intrinsically important that all other hurt and all other costs that's associated with motherhood is something that is out of disregard or is something that they should disregard. So I think that's the first thing that you want to take note of Huiyi's speech, given that the first 3 minutes is perhaps not very relevant in the discussion of this debate. There are two quick points of refutations before moving on to my substantive as to why this hurts feminist movement as a collective. The first point of refutation I want to talk about is just this question about whether the choice is something that's inherently desired by most women under their part. And the response that we heard from Huiyi is pretty disingenuous, because her claim is just to say that it's not a coercive choice because women themselves have sought out fertility treatment or have sought out a greater understanding as to how to be good mothers. But the question that we should ask ourselves is, why did they go to fertility treatments in the first place? Why did they want to learn to be a mother to begin with? And we told you, coming up from the context of Viha, that the sociocultural notion of how the patriarchy has constructed the idea of a mother is something of a lifelong ambition for a woman, means that all the choices and all the information that you have is held hostage by the very same fathers, very same brothers, very same husband that told you that you should be a mother at the end of the day, and that any other kind of positive choices you want to make for yourself, such as being an employed woman or being a career woman, is something that you should not prioritize over the family or should not prioritize over your own children. And I think there's also a question within the debate as to what the comparative is. So as much as you can protect women who are trapped within motherhood in the short term, the question is, how then do we facilitate change in the long term? And I'm going to prove to you within my speech as to why we are best able to facilitate long-term change when people are able to break the conflation that they have, that a woman necessarily equates to a mother, and that the intrinsic experiences of being a mother, no thank you, is something that she should be proud of. The second thing I therefore want to respond quickly is this idea as to whether support is likely to happen when this narrative exists. I think that's why Huiyi ignored a large bulk of like Viha's argumentation when she told you why women have very little choice within the status quo at the point in time where this narrative is promoted all the time. And we told you right from the get-go that the support does not exist because it is seen to be an intrinsically fulfilling experience. No. The fact that it is seen as a beautiful and enjoyable experience, as Huiyi rightfully points out, means that people, and I quote her verbatim, it means that people do not actually think that the cost associated with motherhood is something that's worth evaluating or worth caring about. It means that it's very easy for a husband to dismiss the concerns of his wife, and the wife is saying, I'm fed up with the household chores. The fact that you're not engaging with the household chores on an equal basis is something that hurts me. The only response that she's likely to get from her husband is, you should find it happy being a mother. You should see that this is an intrinsically happy experience. It means that she's blindsided to all the costs that exist. But this cost also manifests to other actors, right? Individuals who are not yet mothers, but also the children or the family unit as a whole. So what happens when a woman decides to keep all this pent-up frustration within herself? She oftentimes finds an outlet to vent out all those frustrations. So I'm pretty sure all of you have had this experience before, where your mother is like, ha, son, I give you all of this. I give up my entire life to make sure that you can go on vacation. I give up my entire life so that you can have a good schooling experience, but yet you do not treat me with any respect. This is a problem, right? Because you actively place the blame that's constructed by the patriarchy upon these children who are vulnerable actors who have had no say in saying that their mother had to sacrifice everything so that they are able to live some sort of a fulfilling experience. What we suggest, therefore, is that you get an active dissolution and breakdown of the family unit, especially when this narrative is propagated. I therefore want to move into my substantive as to why this hurts the feminist movement as a collective, but before I move on, sure. Huiyi?
So are you saying that having children is an inferior choice in life? And if so, how effective is feminism in combating a world that says that motherhood is fulfilling?
All right, so the first thing I want to say in response is that I don't think we ever suggested that having a children is an inferior choice. Again, I refer to what Viha said in like her first minute of her speech. I think that adds a lot of clarity as to what we are willing to defend. But how then do we create the kind of change, especially if those sociocultural norms exist? And at this where my part of my substantive portion is going to come in. So why then does this hurt the feminist movement as a collective? And I think the premise that I want to start off this argument is that the feminist movement's central function is to promote the idea of choice and empowerment. It is the celebration of women's competency and allowing for an equality of rights across both genders. We saw this in the fight for these. We saw this in the fight for suffragette or the first wave feminist movement, or when the feminine mystique that actively question the problem of unpaid labor when a woman is relegated to household work. What we suggest is that this particular narrative that you have right now that says that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience is that you actively regress all of the changes that the feminist movement have been actively fighting for the past number of years. We think this objectively bad. But this narrative is also one that's problematic because the narrative that celebrates motherhood as an intrinsically fulfilling experience is irreconcilable with the narrative of choice. And the reason for that is that the former narrative oftentimes drown out all other discussions, and this is because it is a dominant one that's developed from sociocultural standards that the patriarchy has determined for individuals within society. So for example, it's just unlikely that the feminist movement can on one hand say that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, while at the same time saying that you should be able to prioritize yourself first and foremost and be a career woman if you choose to do so. The second problem is that this narrative actively turns away women who are traumatized by the experiences of motherhood. Individuals who want to have the choice but are now told that the very same feminists that are defending their choice is telling them that they should be motherhood, or that they should engage in the act of motherhood, that is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. But the last thing, therefore, in terms of how we create change, is that we need to break the conflation that exists right now. The women themselves are not consigned to the fate of being mothers, that they should not see it as an intrinsically fulfilling experience. Only then do you create a rational form of thinking that allows women to evaluate what is truly good for them, and for those reasons, you have to stand on the side that actively protects women from all kinds of hurt within society.
I thank the speaker for his speech. I now call upon the second opposition speaker to deliver their speech.
Can everyone hear me? Yep, okay, I'm gonna start. I want to first deal with two things before we move on to my substantive. The first thing I want to talk a bit about narratives in general, and secondly, I want to speak a bit more about the power or influence of those narratives. So let's talk about broadly narratives, right? Or specifically this particular narrative. And this responds directly to the previous speaker. When people say that motherhood is intrinsically fulfilling, the way they express it is that they usually say that motherhood is a very difficult and extremely challenging endeavor to do, but one that is still one of the most beautiful things you can experience in your life. The feminist movement celebrating this narrative doesn't mean they ignore the difficulties as to how this narrative can potentially be corrupted. If you look at narratives as a concept that people like advocate for, they are always going to be privy to corruption. And this exists for motherhood as well as other narratives that the feminist movement decides to celebrate. The question, crucially in this debate therefore, is who are the best actors to control the narratives in a way that minimizes its possibility for corruption? Note that even on prop's side, right, without this narrative being celebrated by the feminist movement, it's still going to exist latently. But who are the actors that are going to control this narrative? The actors are going to be the very people that prop despises. Misogynistic men, men's rights groups, for example, and extremely conservative individuals who have every intention of keeping women down by telling them that even if they choose to be mothers, that is their problem to deal with and not giving them any kind of support. And when the feminist movement does not choose to like celebrate this narrative, but instead regrets it, I think all of the harms that they talk about is going to be far, far worse. Second thing I want to talk about in way of rebuttal, a bit more on narratives, right? I think the way in which I want to discuss this is I want to discuss the degree of agency that women have with regards to whether they can, opt into this narrative in a good way or in a bad way, right? Because Viha says, for example, that you have very little agency to opt into this because everyone tells you that this is how you should live your life, and being a mother is directly connected to your value as a woman. I think there are various degrees of agency that different actors in this debate have, which I think proposition has ignored. Here's my first response. In the first world, I think there's a large degree of agency which exists when interacting with narratives, which means that many women can exercise this narrative just fine. Therefore, I think all the stuff that Huiyi talks about in the first 3 minutes of a speech are still quite relevant because a lot of women do opt into this narrative and they deserve to be celebrated for wanting or thinking that motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience. Second response, for women whose agency is limited, right? Here's where we deal with some of the harms that we talk about. I think you still hurt the empowerment far worse on proposition. How so? I think some of the stuff that Viha says as to how you receive support is slightly misleading. Here's why, 2 reasons, right? The first reason is, usually when you decide to be a mother, for example, usually talk to your own mothers or other women in your life who have become mothers, for example, as like benchmarks as to what to expect in terms of the experience before you even know it. I think this also like goes directly nicely with Huiyi's argument about how a lot of things in life often things that you don't know. Therefore, like to make an argument that just because you don't know about something that therefore it means that it's harmful is not a line of logic that I think works in their case. I think this is something that Farhan didn't actually respond to and simply said that it was irrelevant. Second response, I think new mothers also often have others supporting them. I think this also goes to the crux of something that Prop also ignored that Huiyi talked about. Huiyi talks about how once you agree that a narrative is intrinsically fulfilling, the reason why it's intrinsically fulfilling is because you receive external support and validation from other people in your life. And I think this extends to motherhood as well, especially when it's celebrated. How so? People like grandmothers, for example, often have to take care of your kids and educate them or educate mothers on doing those things. Family members who come and visit you once you are a newly minted mother to take a look at the baby and to also ask about who you are. Hold on a moment. And also individuals who also want to give you support and solace in those moments because that fulfillment is still attached to some external support that is given to you. Yes, Viha.
Intrinsically fulfilling is not the same in definition to just important or valuable. You need to prove that the natural feeling of being fulfilled by this relationship is something that we should continue to perpetuate.
Sure, I think that happens as well. I'll get to that in my substantive, but let me finish my response here, right? I think things that we consider intrinsically fulfilling life are often attached to external support factors, right? Things like childhood, marriage, or like being a parent are considered intrinsically valuable, not just because they are valuable for the person themselves, but because of how that person interacts with other individuals in their life, which therefore means that the experience is valuable. And motherhood is the same thing, right? It's the act of sacrifice in terms of sacrificing your own wishes for the life of someone else and giving that life to someone else. I think narrating that sort of vision and narrative can still be very empowering in society. I think the potential strongest argument on opposition prop, therefore, and this goes on to my substantive, as to how this narrative is likely to be corrupted. Here's why I think corruption is less likely to happen on outside of the house. In cases of corruption of a narrative, if the narrative doesn't exist, less support is given to women because the people around them think that this is a choice that women consented to anyway, and therefore they shouldn't be expecting any kind of support. But the second reason why, and this goes on to the narrative and how it's good, right? This narrative enables women from conservative backgrounds to access a form of empowerment which increases their satisfaction. The premise here is that women in many conservative countries like India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Iran often become mothers not fully always out of choice, but out of circumstance of poverty. Note that this group is going to exist even if feminists reject this narrative on prop, because that brand of feminism is not going to be adopted in those society. I think, therefore, this narrative is going to be uniquely helpful for these groups of people for two sorts of reasons. First reason, it allows them to extract some value from their unfortunate circumstance. This looks like feminist groups in these areas going to these women and getting them to form like informal support structures by getting them to like talk about their backgrounds together. So even if motherhood is something that's expected to be intrinsically fulfilling for you as an individual, you can share that experience with other mothers in your community. And this is something that happens in places like Nigeria, in places like Bangladesh, for example, where informal support groups exist to help women navigate this experience of motherhood and not see it as something that's wasted, but instead something that they can still find empowerment in. Secondly, it's also about providing these mothers with support, right? A lot of difficulty in valuing your life when it centers around motherhood comes because you feel like your journey is solitary. I think celebrating this narrative makes the journey feel less solitary, something that you individually consented to, and something that the feminist movement is willing to support you in, as well as other people in your life who are close to you as well. I think support structures that this provides can only be accessed the moment this narrative is out in the mainstream. Rejecting it reduces the level of agency and empowerment that women have. I'm very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech. I now call upon the third proposition speaker to deliver their speech.
Hello everyone, can you guys hear me? Just testing. Sweet. Okay, with all due respect, maybe it's just me being particularly stupid, but I don't quite understand what the hell the opposition side is saying. And I think that's true for one very, very simple reason, which is you don't use big fancy words as substitutes for actual analysis. And as a result of that, I'm going to be talking about one key point today. And if I can cover that one key point, maybe I'll consider covering the long-term implications of this policy, what the trade-offs we have to make are. But the one key point is about characterization. What exactly does opposition mean by controlling the narrative, right? Because frankly speaking, it's all a pile of nonsense to me, right? As far as I'm concerned, like what men are saying to women, like their mothers, their wives, their daughters, is your place is in the household. You need to be able to do this. It's intrinsically important. You know, you should not leave your post. You should not go out and have a career of your own. You should not decide not have kids. And what women do in response on the opposition side is say, we agree with this. Oh yeah, we're going to support this narrative that, you know, motherhood is intrinsically important. You should all stay at home. That is not controlling the narrative. That is merely acquiescing, agreeing to the very patriarchal structures which men have already placed upon you. Just because you affirm it, just because you provide support groups to other mothers to say, don't worry, we understand your struggle, motherhood is intrinsically important. It doesn't A, change how men treat you. It doesn't A, change the fact that men treat women as inferior people, or that they see motherhood as an inferior role, or that the real reason why they say that motherhood is intrinsically important is not actually because they believe motherhood is intrinsically important, it's because they want to con you into thinking that motherhood is intrinsically important so that you'll be happy staying where you are. At that point in time, then you don't control the narrative at all. And think about it. I think my two previous speakers have already told you about this, but when, you know, as a mother, you are being bombarded from day to day with your everyday injustices. Men refusing to do housework, men refusing to allow you to earn your own salary, men refusing you to make decisions outside the household because after all, motherhood is an intrinsically important thing and that's where you ought to be. And then the women, other women in your life, your mothers, your grandmothers are telling you the same thing. Women in these circumstances don't actually feel heard. So you're there being support groups for women don't actually translate into the woman in question feeling supported, because all they seem to think is that, you know, all these other women in my life have bought the same koyo that the men have been selling them, and that they're now trying to translate that into selling me that koyo, and I don't feel supported at all. It doesn't, grandiose statements about being supported, or that motherhood is an intrinsically important thing, don't square with the everyday indignities that women have to face. Your husband not bothering to help clean the house, or not washing the dishes, or not even taking care of the children for 1 minute because that's supposed to be your job. So I don't see how we're controlling the narrative. And if opposition can't even win this basic argument, they lose this debate, right? Because every argument they have is premised on the notion of controlling the narrative. If they can control the narrative, then they can create some benefit for women. If they can create some benefit for women, then we talk about the trade-offs, the harm versus benefits. But if they can't even prove this basic premise, they don't have any benefits, which means they don't win this debate at all. So, but in addition to that, I want to cover a couple of things, right? The idea that, Subra asserts that somehow, the alternative is not that women can control this narrative. The alternative is that women are assumed to consent to this. I'm like, no, because the alternative is either you have other women, older women, influential women in your life, your village, acquiesce to this thing, support it, shape other women who don't believe into believing in it, or you get the women to collectivize and say, no, I think this narrative is nonsense. I think we think this narrative is nonsense, and that we're going to try and carve an alternative path for ourselves, just like how feminist movements elsewhere have carved out alternative paths for themselves. Will this subject you to lots of persecution by then? Yes, that's true, like most social movements. But over the course of a couple of generations, what eventually happens is, at the very least, you're not alone. There are other women out there who agree with you that this narrative is nonsense, and that there are other ways to be a woman, other ways to be a successful person. And eventually you get enough of a critical mass of people to believe this idea, both like within your local communities, as well as like your networks in like higher up places, such that you can eventually get access to better jobs, or that you can get access to political power, and slowly you build your way up, and then you change the system around you. I think this is just the basic model for how social movements have worked, and that is a far reasonable alternative, rather than this artificial counterfactual they try to present to you, which is, oh no, but then women are assumed to have consented to it. No, you don't. The last thing I want to tackle under this argument is that, somehow it is necessary to affirm this narrative in order to get feminist movements to provide support. I'll show you why that's nonsense in a bit, but first I'll take Subra's POI.
So you criticize our side or case for assuming that feminists can collectivize around this narrative and create some support structures. But the solution on your side is that magically feminists have that same collective power, but can instead use that in positive ways. Like, if that is true and symmetric on both sides, right, why can't we also have some benefits related to collectivization if that's a realistic goal that you are also agreeing with?
So it's not symmetric because it's about the message you're sending, right? If other women tell me that, oh yeah, you're right, this is actually nonsense, that men should be having the fair share of the housework, should not just be at home, then the woman feels hurt because that information, that message squares with the everyday experiences that they have. Whereas in your scenario, they're actually probably going to shame the woman and say, oh yeah, mother is intrinsically important, this kind of suffering is worth handling, this is your purpose in life, right? Best case scenario, sure, the woman feels supported, but you don't have any social change. Worst case scenario, the woman doesn't feel hurt and you don't actually get the support you want. And so support can exist on both sides. The question is what you use the support for. And you're probably right. If the argument is symmetric, then we can get feminists supporting mothers without telling the mothers that whatever they're doing is intrinsically important. So you see how the argument works against you as well. So at the end of the day, they fail to prove the basic premise, the idea that there is such a thing as control over the narrative. The only alternative that's reasonable is to fight against that narrative. That's how we achieve social change.
I thank the speaker for his speech. I now call upon the third opposition speaker to deliver their speech.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Two clashes in this speech. The first is about what does the feminist movement need at the moment and how can it better serve the needs of women, because no one in this debate or in proposition wanted to weigh this out and just rather assertively pushed for how they wanted complete liberation from the experience of motherhood, all being very uncomparative to the analysis that was forwarded in Huiyi's speech when she gave you 3 concrete reasons by which she explained why it was intrinsically a fulfilling experience. The second part of my speech will deal with the clash about whether or not motherhood is intrinsically a fulfilling experience or not, and this will resolve largely the deadlock that happened and the whole push on Adil's speech earlier when he said that we didn't prove any substantial benefit. I'll explain all that later on in the second clash, because I think a lot of it was already argued in the first 2 speakers in my bench, but they just conveniently ignored them. All right, so let's talk about the first clash. Proposition in this debate wants the complete liberation of women from the entirety of the motherhood experience. Right? That is necessarily true because if you listen to Viha's speech basically argues that this is a choice that you can never truly opt into because you only will ever have a theoretical or academic idea of what motherhood is, and therefore whatever choices you're making in this particular instance is going to be illegitimate. I think Huiyi responds to this pretty persuasively, but what I want to add on here is this, that this is just not true because I think a lot of the times, right, the goal of the feminist movement isn't liberation from the motherhood experience only, but it's about widening access to what feminism can do for you as a woman. So we would suggest to you that a lot of the times, the strong career woman that you want to empower with all these narratives, the ones that really want to be independent, strong career, unmarried women, are going to be that way anyway. The question in this debate is, what about the intersectional identities? The mothers that perhaps don't really want to climb the corporate ladder, but perhaps want to have some sort of meaningful motherhood experience along with that middle management career track that they would like to be on. We think that in this debate, being able to claim that, or being able to reclaim this particular narrative in the way that we've described earlier or argued earlier, means that, for example, these women are able to do things like use their extra time, right, while being at home, even if it means in the first few years they have to resign, right, and they have to take a step back and they have to, raise the child from home before re-entering the workplace after, because they have to take care of the child in their infant years. In this particular instance, what can possibly happen? I think what the feminist movement promoting this particular narrative looks like is like telling them, guys, like there exists currently a lot of online distance learning courses by universities that are very reputable. These are ways for you to keep yourself relevant in terms of skilling, for example. We think that part of reclaiming this narrative is about telling women that like motherhood specifically is something that you can define on your own terms. And I think this is where I want to bring up the fact that they were unresponsive. I think a lot of the responses from our opponents were just very uncomparative to what Huiyi does in her speech, because Huiyi already tells you that just because something is an intrinsically fulfilling experience doesn't mean that it is incorruptible. I think a lot of those responses that they had were very problematic because it assumed that the external forces of men trying to exploit their power asymmetry, for example, is something that's going to bleed into the lives of these women at home when they choose to be mothers. When that is precisely what Huiyi did to preempt that particular response, and they don't actually respond to any material thereafter, right? We think that that's the reason why they lose on that particular basis. So I would suggest, as a conclusion to this clash on what feminist movement needs right now, is this, that they need to be able to empower women and tell women that you can have you can have some career success, but also be a mother. And I think that's a legitimate choice for you to opt into. And it doesn't mean that you have to be that you have to be a strong career woman to be considered a feminist or pro-women. I think the side of their side is one that alienates women from conservative contexts, for example, that wish to be mothers, but often feel alienated from the feminist movement, who often end up not helping out to join the movement or galvanize with the movement when it comes to social media activism with like #MeToo, for example, which we think a critical mass would be significantly lesser on their side, because on these reconcilable grounds such as like sexual assault or rape, victim blaming culture, like these women that feel alienated because of the fact that their identities as mothers aren't seen as liberated enough would be the reason why those very women aren't going to be part of the critical mass that's required for the feminist movement right now in its fourth wave to be able to do things like pressure for legislative changes. We think that's the reason why we should prioritize as the feminist movement to ensure that we get those women on board, right? Those particular women that want motherhood as an experience. And we think that enabling it as an intrinsically fulfilling experience is something that is important here. Yes, Farhan.
So just to be clear, coming up from proposition, we never said that we would demonize individuals who choose to be mother. What we suggested is popping up a counter narrative that says that this celebration of motherhood is not an intrinsic one and it shouldn't be the priority for women.
Yeah, that's just really disingenuous, because literally Viha like explains the whole reason why that choice can never be a valid choice to begin with. So it's kind of disingenuous to say that you're not implying at the very least that you are doing something to invalidate the choices of women on the ground. And obviously the effects of alienation, while not intentional on the part of the feminist movement, is exactly what I was describing earlier. That unintentional alienating effect is what causes the feminist movement to lose traction on your side. The second thing about the whether or not motherhood is an intrinsically fulfilling experience, I think here's where I want to point out, right, that a lot of the reason why motherhood in the past was incredibly oppressive was because women didn't have access to things like education. They just didn't have those structural support systems available for them. We think that what happens right now in the status quo is that motherhood has evolved to a point whereby motherhood is not something that causes women to have to trade off a whole lot of their entire lifetimes in the way that it did in the past, that outweighed the intrinsically meaningful benefits that came along with that particular motherhood experience. These things were covered by Huiyi and Subra, but they never really wanted to respond to it, and for these reasons, we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech. We will now move on to the Team's 3-minute concluding reply speeches. There are no points of information during reply speeches. After 2 minutes, the timekeeper will signal once to let the speaker know they have 1 minute left. At 3 minutes, the timekeeper will signal twice. To deliver the opposition reply speech, I call upon Huiyi.
You know, a sculptor thinks her life worthwhile because of the figures that she has crafted painstakingly from clay. And when a movement like feminism that purports to stand for women wants to tell you, as the prop suggests, that this work is not beautiful and not meaningful, firstly, that is just untrue and not fair to the agency of mothers. But secondly, even if a mother's life should turn out unexpectedly difficult, we are the only ones that therefore create an aspirational high watermark that now pushes society to help women get to the point where motherhood lives out to its intrinsically fulfilling nature. Two things I want to talk about. Firstly, how feminists should help mothers view motherhood. So, or rather, how feminists think women should view the process of motherhood. So, even though they claim otherwise, there is an implicit assumption on proposition that motherhood is just not a good choice or a good way to live. But at the same time, the DPM tells us that motherhood is not an inferior choice in the eyes of of feminists on their side. So okay, let's go with that. In that case, their key contention is with the idea of intrinsically. But we don't understand why prop thinks that it's no intrinsic fulfillment to motherhood. They gave us a reason that is a long-term commitment. But if your reason for saying something is not inherently valuable is because it is long-term, then nothing major in your life whatsoever has intrinsic value. And we don't think that is really the line the proposition goes for, because they obviously think that certain lifestyles or value judgments are inherently better anyway. But also they told us that another reason is that people often make it very difficult for mothers to live empowered lives. Firstly, as Subra already mentioned, often things that are fulfilling can also be difficult. But also that means that intrinsically, motherhood is still a good thing. We just need to stop people, society, men, right, from ruining it for them. You can only ruin something that had value to begin with. And a word that doesn't understand how motherhood is good would also never understand how the other ones that are truly ruining it for mothers everywhere. But that brings me on to my second point on comparative outcomes. And there are two groups of people I want to talk about. Firstly, people, the large majority who do choose to experience motherhood. We are the ones that allow these women to get support, because now feminism pushes the world to recognize that this motherhood is a good thing that is worth promoting. Therefore, as a mother, you still feel affirmed as a good feminist or a true woman, even if you have chosen to prioritize your motherhood over, say, your career or other conventional markers of material success. At the same time, it's easier for you to argue for things like maternity leave instead of being shamed, because now feminism tells your workplace, tells the corporate environment, these women are doing noble, fulfilling things, and therefore we should support them in getting there instead of, say, firing them or removing benefits should they choose to get pregnant. But also about people who feel pressured into motherhood. As already mentioned by my previous speakers, at the very least, they don't feel disempowered or ineligible for other things that feminism stands for, because they feel as though their choice is legitimate and fulfilling. But also, we think that is therefore far more important than prop's priority of people who choose to stay child-free, because these people often have the social capital to defy convention and do what they want in their lives anyway. We therefore help mothers, be those who relish motherhood or those who feel pressured from the start. I'm extremely proud to oppose.
And now, to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I call upon Viha.
There are two phrases in this motion that are important to remember. The first is feminists should regret, and the second is intrinsically fulfilling experience. A lot of what side opposition has done with their case is to purposely blur the really obvious definitions of what these phrases are. Let's start with that second one of intrinsically fulfilling. Almost all of Huiyi's speech in first opposition, and even Subra's in second, conflates intrinsically fulfilling with important or valuable or good. It is perfectly okay to say that all choices that women make have value. They should be supported. They should be given assistance on. None of them have to be sold as intrinsically fulfilling to make that happen. The definition of that phrase should have been obvious. That intrinsically fulfilling means that it is naturally and biologically should give you happiness or satisfaction. Considering that, all of opposition's analysis about support flies out the window, because it is exactly a narrative of biological, natural happiness that means that support should be unnecessary, that asking for assistance is asking for too much, and that fulfillment is something that all humans should want, so how dare you pretend like it doesn't make you happy. We think that that's the exact kind of situation that mothers fall victim to, because they are told that motherhood should give you an intrinsic sense of fulfillment, an intrinsic sense of happiness, and therefore there is no need to seek out external validation, there is no need to seek out any sort of external narrative. So no, a narrative of motherhood being an intrinsically fulfilling experience has no benefits, and people should not be persuaded to join it because of an intrinsic fulfillment, especially uninformed. The only thing Op has to say to any of this is, but almost all choices are uninformed anyway. Yeah, sure, but other choices don't tell you that you are born to make this choice. The toxic manipulative attitude of saying something is natural is the problem that, and it's the thing that they never engage on Op, because all of their benefits fly for as long as we say motherhood is good, or motherhood is important, or motherhood is valuable, but none of them connect to an analysis about why motherhood should be naturally fulfilling for an individual, and that alone should be a reason why they lose. But let's look at the other phase of this motion. Feminists should regret. The first thing we need to say is that regretting the narrative is not what Joelle pretends it is. It is not a complete hatred of motherhood. It is a hatred of telling women that they are guaranteed to get happiness and fulfillment from it. Subra says feminists need to celebrate this because we need to be able to control the narrative away from misogynist men. The reality of continuing to celebrate it is that there is nothing to control. It just perpetuates the problem of this narrative in the first place. What the feminist movement needs to do is to facilitate women having choice. That they should absolutely have the choice to decide that motherhood is good or not for them without being manipulated to think one way or the other because of the way society tells them is natural for their bodies. Regretting this narrative does not take away anything from mothers who do indeed feel fulfillment from it. Feminists are happy for women who manage it, but indeed they have a priority to help the women who are victims of this narrative by being the place that women can turn to for help to escape the shackles of motherhood that this narrative places on all women purely because of how they are born. We propose.
Thank you, Viha. We have now come to the end of the Debate Association Exhibition Debate 2020. I thank our debaters for their enthusiastic participation for this insightful and interesting debate.